Hello again. In this lesson, we will learn about pivot tables in VBA. Pivot tables simplify the way we work with data in Excel. It helps us summarize and tell a story with the data quickly and easily. Therefore, it is very important that we learn how to automate the creation of a pivot table, but we have to learn how to do it dynamically, as hard coding is probably not the best way to go in programming, unless it is necessary. That being said, let's add a new module which name will be pivot. For that, go to the Insert menu in the toolbar, click on Module, then resize the module inside the code window. Here we are going to delete the default name added by Excel VBA so that we can add our custom name, pivot. Now we are going to add a new sub-procedure which name is going to be pivot as well. Following that, we are going to declare our variables. For that, we are going to add a comment. We're going to say declare variables, and then we're going to type in dim last row as long, dim last call as long, dim source as string, dim destination as string, dim ws as worksheet. We need to assign values to our variables. For that, we are going to add a comment here, assign values to variables, and then we are going to say last row, this is going to be equal to cells rows.count. Here we're going to say that we're going to be looking at column 1, which is column A. Then here we're going to say end Excel up dot row. What we're doing here is finding the last row with data. Then we're going to say last call. This is going to be equal to range A1, comma range A1 dot end. Between parentheses, we're going to say Excel to right dot count. What we're doing here is finding the last column with data in the worksheet. The reason we are doing this is because we want to get the complete data source regardless of whether the number of rows or columns changes. Then we're going to say source. This is going to be equal to data types dot name. We are going to concatenate this with this character, which is going to be concatenated with the following code. So here we're going to say range A1, comma cells. Between parentheses, we're going to provide the last row and the last column. Then we are going to say dot address, reference style, which is going to be equal to Excel R1C1. This is the code that is going to help us get the data source dynamically. Then we're going to assign a value to our WS object. So here we're going to say set WS. This is going to be equal to sheets.add. Between parentheses, we're going to say after sheets. Between parentheses again, we're going to say sheets.count. The pivot table is going to be added in this new worksheet that we're going to be adding here. Then we're going to say destination. This is going to be equal to ws.name, which is going to be concatenated with the following. And this is going to be concatenated with this code. We're going to say here range A4, because we want the pivot table to be added in range A4 in the new worksheet. Then here we're going to say address, between parentheses, reference style. This is going to be equal to Excel R1C1. After this, we're going to create our pivot table. So here we're going to add a comment, create pivot table, and then we're going to say active workbook dot pivot catches dot create. Between parentheses, we need to define the source. So we're going to say source type. This is going to be equal to Excel database. Then we're going to say comma source data. So let's type it in correctly, source data, which is going to be equal to our variable source. Dot underscore, because we are going to continue writing code in the next line. We're going to say here create pivot table space, and then we're going to say table destination. This is going to be equal to our destination variable. Then we're going to say comma table name. Here we're going to provide any name to our pivot table. In this case, I'm going to say table 1. Now we're going to add a name to the new worksheet. So here we're going to add a comment, add name to new worksheet. For that, we're going to say active sheet dot name. This is going to be equal to, let's say, pivot table, for example. Then we're going to add the state column to the filter field of the pivot table. For that, we're going to say add filter to pivot table state. So here we're going to say with active sheet dot pivot table. Between parentheses, we're going to provide the name of the pivot table, which is table 1. Then here we're going to say dot pivot fields. Between parentheses, we need to define the column that we're going to add. So that's going to be the state column. Then here we're going to say and with, and inside the with and with statement, we're going to say orientation, for example. This is going to be equal to Excel page field. So we're going to say here page field. Then here we're going to say position. This is going to be equal to 1. Then we're going to add the department column to the row field of the pivot table. So here we're going to say add department column, let's type it in correctly, to row field of pivot table. For that, we're going to say with active sheet dot pivot tables. We need to define the name of the pivot table, which is table 1. Then we're going to say here dot pivot fields. We said it's going to be the department column, so we're going to say department. Then we're going to close the with and with statement, and inside we're going to say orientation. This is going to be equal to Excel row field. So let's say row field. Then here we're going to say that position. This is going to be equal to 1. Now we need to add some values to the pivot table. So here we're going to say add count of employees. For that, we're going to be using the employee name column. So we're going to say here with active sheet, and then we're going to close it by typing in and with. Inside the with and with statement, we're going to say dot pivot tables. Here we're going to provide the name of the pivot table, table 1, dot add data field. Here we're going to say active sheet dot pivot tables. We're going to say again table 1 dot underscore, because we will continue writing code in the next line. So here we're going to say pivot tables, pivot fields actually. And here we said that the field we are going to be adding here is the employee name. So here we're going to say employee name, comma, employees by department. This is the name that is going to be reflected in the pivot table. And we want the count of employees. So we're going to say Excel count. So let's type it in correctly. We want to sort the count of employees from largest to smallest. For that, we're going to say that pivot tables. Again, we're going to provide the name, table 1. Then here we're going to say dot pivot fields. Between parentheses, we're going to say department dot outer sort Excel descending. So let's complete it. Then here we're going to say comma, and again what we want to sort is the employees by department column. We're going to say here employees by department. Let's go ahead and change this from capital B to lowercase b, just to make sure it's the same thing here. We also want to see the average salary by department. For that, we're going to go and say here at average salary by department, and then we're going to say with active sheet and with. Inside the and with statement, we're going to say that pivot tables, table 1, because this is going to be added to the values field. We're going to say here add data field, active sheet dot pivot tables. So between parentheses, again, we're going to be adding the pivot table name, which is table 1. Then here we're going to say dot underscore, because we will continue writing code in the next line. So here we're going to say pivot fields, salary, because we want the average salary. So for that, we're going to be adding the salary column. Then here we're going to say comma, and the name we want to reflect in the pivot table is average salary. Again, we need to define that this is average. So we're going to say Excel average. We want to reflect the salary in currency format. For that, we're going to say that range C6, because the salary is going to be added in column C of the pivot table. C6, here we're going to say comma range. again C6 dot end. Between parentheses, we're going to say Excel down. Then we're going to say dot number format. This is going to be equal to, let's go to Excel and click anywhere in column E. Then we're going to say Control 1. So we're going to click on custom and grab the format. This is the format that we want to reflect in the pivot tables. So we're going to click on cancel and then add the format here. Let's go ahead and debug the code now to see the results. So just press F8 on the keyboard. Here we're going to assign the values to last row, last column, source. Here we're going to be setting the value of worksheet, which by the way is going to be adding a new worksheet. Here we're setting the values for destination, and now we're going to create the pivot table. It's going to be empty because at this point we haven't added any fields. So now we are going to add a name or rename the new worksheet that we added to pivot table. As we can see, it was done correctly. Here we're going to be adding filters to this pivot table. We're going to be adding the state column as a filter. So let's go ahead and do it. As you can see, the filter was added. Now we are going to be adding rows. For that, we're going to be adding the department column in the row field of the pivot table. Here we're going to be adding values to the pivot table. So we're going to be showing the count of employees by department. And we also, as you can see, this is not sorted. So we are going to sort it from largest to smallest. So let's go ahead and step into this code line. It was done correctly. Now we're going to be adding the salary, but we want to see the average salary. So let's go ahead and see what happens. And now we want to format the salary. Right now it's not formatted correctly. We want to show it in currency format. And this code is going to help us do it. So let's go ahead and press F8 to see what we get. As you can see, this is the way we create pivot tables dynamically in VBA. That would be it for now. In our next lesson, we will learn about pivot charts in VBA. See you next time.